Good morning, church. Go ahead and take a Bible out. You'll need a Bible to follow along today in the message. Ken and I have looked at Hebrews chapter 11, and there are a bunch of people that are mentioned who had faith, and they were ordinary people, ordinary men and women. Actually, they had their lives messed up by different events and things. But these ordinary people did extraordinary things for God. And today we're going to see another of these examples in Joseph. And our preacher, Kent, just loves the story of Joseph. I just heard from Kent a little while ago. You know that he is excited to get back and see all of you. So I can't wait till he comes home and Jeff can have a break from preaching. You can have a break from listening to me for a while, right? But Joseph is the guy that we're looking at today. And his story is not only found in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. Hebrews 11, just verse 22. Yeah, notice that how Paul in Hebrews chapter 11 just mentions like in one verse, one whole person and their entire life and sums it up by saying, by faith they did some things that were extraordinary, you know. So you can do extraordinary things also. What did Joseph do? Well, we're going to see that Joseph, he found God. He found God in some very unusual places, some places that you wouldn't expect to find God. So this week I did a little study myself to see where people are finding God. I saw that one person found Jesus on a piece of toast. Another person found Jesus on a tortilla. You know, the whole tortilla had a picture of Jesus on it somehow. If you found Jesus on a tortilla, I want you to realize that that is not what this sermon is about. I found a picture of a banana that had Jesus. Actually, that looked like Jesus on the banana, but a banana that had a picture of Jesus on it. And you know about the famous potato chip with a picture of Jesus on it. Well, you can search the internet if you'd like to find all of these places where you could find a picture of Jesus, but that's not really where Joseph found God. You know, Joseph found God in some difficult times in his life and sometimes that things were going great for him. And I'm going to suggest that you, Christian, can find God in some unusual, difficult places that you're cast into in life. By faith, you can find God in some unusual places. And today, we're going to notice where Joseph found God. Where did Joseph find God? Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. If you turn to that passage, let me read it. And then we're going to go back and look at some events in Joseph's life and see where he found God. And I hope that you can find God in those places as well. Not on a tortilla or on a potato chip, but really find God, know that He is near, and that you are not abandoned. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22 says, by faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Well, you don't find out a lot about Joseph other than that he's dying, right? But he was in the Old Testament, so a few thousand years back, not 2,000, but more than 3,000 years ago is this guy named Joseph, who was able to find God in some events in his life. And today we're going to examine some of those events and see if you can't also find God in your life in some of these events as well. The first place that that I want us to look at anyway, where Joseph found God was in that pit. You remember the story of Joseph being thrown into a pit by his brothers? You remember that he was thrown in that pit, and then they decided, well, instead of throwing him in a pit, instead of killing him, we'll try to make some money off of this and sell him into slavery, who he ended up being sold into slavery in Egypt. So there are a couple of stories in Joseph's life that find him in a confined space. It wasn't just the time that he was thrown in a pit, but another time he was in prison. Let me tell you a little bit about those two stories, and you can follow along if you'd like in Genesis, but you're going to have to start in chapter 37 of Genesis and kind of follow the story about Joseph. Joseph and his brothers, Joseph's brothers were out tending to their flock, and Joseph went looking for him. He had been sent there by his father. And when he found him, he was wearing that. What do you know about Joseph? He was wearing I was going to say he was wearing a pair of shoes, but yeah. Coat of many colors, right. Yeah, Joseph was wearing that coat of many colors, and his brothers found him, and his brothers did not like the fact that, his dad kind of played favorites with Joseph's mother, and he did have several other stepmoms, is that what they would be called, or sister wives of Joseph's mom. And remember that Joseph's dad had, he would be the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, but he would also indulge in polygamy, which God never outlined for his people. But, sometimes God's people do their own thing, and they don't listen to God. Joseph had dreamt about his brothers. Dreamed. He had dreamed about his brothers bowing down to him. And if you're going to have a dream about that, like that with your siblings, you're not going to tell them, okay? Joseph made the mistake of telling his brothers, hey, I had a dream, and you guys were all bowing down to me, and I was in charge. And his brothers didn't like that very much. So when they found him, come and look for where they were in Dothan, the brothers took Joseph and threw him into a dried-up cistern. Not a brethren, but a cistern. If you've not ever had a cistern before, you know that it's a container in the ground, and either water is collected there or you ship water and put it in there so that you can use that water. But if, in a dry season, there wouldn't be any water in it. And Joseph is thrown into a pit like that. His brothers have now silenced him. However, they decide that they're going to sell him into slavery. For 20 shekels of silver, they sold him into the slave trade, and eventually Joseph would be purchased by Egypt, and eventually Jacob would conclude that Joseph, his son, with the coat of many colors, was devoured by a beast. Joseph got out of that pit, but later he would find himself in another confined space, another prison. In Potiphar's house, Joseph had a little problem, and I'll mention what that problem was in just a little while. But Potiphar, the commander of Pharaoh in Egypt, Potiphar threw Joseph into prison. And there, along with the butler and the baker, he found himself a license plate maker. Joseph found that God was with him in prison. And if you want to look in chapter 39, you can see that chapter 39 even mentions that God was with Joseph. God was with Joseph in this pit, and God was with Joseph in this prison. And if you find yourself in some of the pits and prisons of this life, in some of the valleys of life rather than on the mountaintop, if you find yourself in situations like that, look around, because God has not abandoned you. And it's always easier to go through these valleys of our life with God beside us. You've not been abandoned. He'll never leave or forsake us. You can put God and His people in a prison. You can make them captive. You can cause people to forget God and His people. But God will not be forgotten, and He will not be restricted to a prison. He isn't gone, and you are not alone. I know sometimes it seems like things are difficult, and you may feel like you're in a deep valley in life and in a pit. Everybody's abandoned you. Family that loved you has forsaken you, or maybe even thought about killing you like Joseph's family did. You're sold as a piece of property. Imagine how inviting the cistern looked after you were put in a cage and wheeled off into slavery. Is there any way that you could drop me off in that hole again? We all have our pits and our prisons. Something that our own country is going through right now. Hey, dealing with slavery, where people are sold into sexual slavery. in our own country. What a shame it is. What a shame and an odious thing slavery has always been. Even in Joseph's day, he experienced this. You know, it seems like a lot of people, heroes of mine in the faith, spent time in jail, in prison. I told Kent one time, I thought about a sermon series on looking at all the people that were ever imprisoned in the Bible for their faith. It would be a long series, right? And Joseph, I guess, would be one of those people, but God's people seem to find their way in trouble a lot in this world that we live in. And if you've found yourself in trouble, look around and find God in that pit or in that prison. Believers have done this for years now. Coming up on, 3,000? Somebody's going to tell me later how many years it was from Joseph to today. You know, I don't want to know about approximately, but you could come up with maybe the number. 3,227. I'm not sure. We'll try to look at that later. But I do know that God is the same God who was enthroned before Joseph was put in prison as after Joseph was put in prison. And He's still the same powerful, almighty God whenever you're going through the valleys of life as He was whenever you were living on the mountaintop, when things were going right for you. It's the same God, and I know you may long for the warmth of your colorful coat. You may long for the deep pit because it gives you a little bit of comfort. But know this, that whatever you go through in life, that God will not abandon or forsake you. If you're going through something today and you think that that's your pit, listen, you can find God in that pit just the same as Joseph did. What kind of pit have you been thrown into? And are you even looking for God in that pit, or have you given up looking for God? I know that we do a lot of complaining when we're in that pit, right? When we go through the valleys of life, we complain, and we complain loud, right? And we want people to listen to us complain. But while you're complaining about how unfair your circumstances are, look around, because God is there, and He's doing something through that pit that you're in, just the same as He did with Joseph, when Joseph was in that pit and when Joseph was in that prison. God is doing something with us. He's moving in our lives. He's moving in our lives like He was moving in the lives of Paul and Silas in Acts. You remember in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas were in jail. They were in prison. And about midnight, verse 25 says, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns. You know, they weren't crying or complaining. They were praying and singing hymns to God. And the other prisoners were listening to them. Do you think God was with Paul and Silas? You better believe He was. And you better believe that He's with you through those times of difficulty as well. And I don't know what those times are, but look around, because God is near. Another really good example is in Daniel chapter 3. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 24 and 25, maybe you remember this story. It's about three guys whose names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And a fellow by the name of Nebuchadnezzar threw them into a fiery furnace. Actually, they fell, along with the people that were trying to get them into the furnace. They fell into this furnace, and there Nebuchadnezzar says these words. And King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that I had tied up and thrown into the fire?" And they replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty. 3 men thrown and put into that fire." And he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed." And you remember that at the end of the story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't even smell of fire. Now, you try going out to barbecue some hot dogs on a fire, or you try lighting a campfire and see if you don't smell like fire for the next week, right? They didn't even smell like fire. And he said, unbound and unharmed, they're walking around there. And look, isn't that 4th guy, doesn't he look like the Son of God? The Son of God will meet you in the flames. either in the pit or in the prison or in the flames, the Son of God is there. He'll never leave you or forsake you. Joseph did find God in the pit, in the prison, in the difficulties in his life, and you can too. But Joseph also found God in the palace. Another couple of stories that come from the life of Joseph in Genesis chapter 39, actually. Genesis chapter 39, the beginning of that chapter, at the end of that chapter, both mention that Yahweh, God, is with Joseph in his high position. And he was in some high positions. When Joseph was first put into slavery, he worked in a guy by the name of Potiphar. That was not his first name. That was just a description of what he did. But Potiphar's house, he was serving Pharaoh, and Potiphar had a nice house, and Joseph was in charge of it. And he was put in charge of the house. But you think that that's a life of ease is what you're looking for, right? Joseph had problems in Potiphar's house. One of them he dealt with every day, and that was Potiphar's wife. If you've not ever read that story, I'm going to encourage you to turn to Genesis chapter 39 sometime and read the story of what happened to Joseph. It went a little something like this. Every day, this woman annoyed him and tried to entice him into taking her to bed. And this was Potiphar's wife. And all of these times, Joseph said no. Finally, one last time, she got a hold of his cloak. And Joseph, being a man of God, knew to leave that behind, leave everything behind, and run for your life. Joseph dealt with many occasions where it was hard living in the palace. It was hard having all these responsibilities. And maybe you're in the palace of your life right now and things are going great. Hey, it may be difficult right now for you. Joseph found God in the palace where things were not always easy or simple. Later, Joseph he'd go to prison for that little stint with Potiphar's wife. She figured out a way to get him in jail. And while he's in prison there, making license plates with the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker, with all those other guys, Joseph is made eventually second in charge of all of Egypt. You know the rest of that story, right? Do you know the story? In Genesis chapter 39. Actually, you could read 39 on through 50, the rest of the story about Joseph. But Joseph ended up marrying, maybe it wasn't his choice, but it was God's choice. He married a pagan princess. It seems to have worked out okay for Manasseh and Ephraim. And now we don't even think about the 12 tribes of Israel, about Joseph being, where's he at in the 12 tribes? Well, he's counted twice through his children, Manasseh and Ephraim. He's counted 2 different times in the 12 tribes of Israel, Joseph is. But while he's in Egypt, he takes care of his own family. In fact, eventually his family would come and live in northern Egypt with the Pharaoh. Jacob blesses Pharaoh. A couple of them had Egyptian funerals, which you can imagine what that would be like, the regular embalming process for the Egyptians. And Joseph himself underwent that same embalming process. But he also saved 75 members of his own family by bringing them to Egypt and feeding them. In fact, the whole world, the whole known world, was coming to Egypt for grain because Egypt had prepared for a great famine. And it was God who was with Joseph and gave Joseph the interpretation of these dreams so that many nations would be saved through Joseph. Instead of being corrupted by the power in the palace, God used him to serve even his own family and save even their lives. God was powerful in the palace. And if right now your life could be described as being in the palace, you've got worries, you've got concerns. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. People who have great wealth still have problems. And they need to find God even in the palace. Whether you struggle because you have money or because you have no money. Whether you struggle because you're in good health or in bad. Whether you struggle because of life's difficulties or whether you don't struggle at all of us still need God's presence. We need His presence as much in the palace as we did when Joseph was in the pit and in the prison. God was there with Joseph. And if you're in the palace with all these responsibilities and worries, know that God will be there with you as well. The same as He was with Joseph when Joseph was in the palace. He'll be there with you, and maybe it would result in the salvation of many lives, like it was for Joseph, just because you've shared your faith. In times of plenty and in times of want, whether you're in the valley or whether you're on the mountaintop, we still all need to find God, even in the palace. In Acts chapter 7, this is Stephen, the deacon, Stephen, the martyr, who in Acts chapter 7 is being put to death. And it's interesting that Stephen says this about Joseph's life. Listen to this. Because the patriarchs were jealous of Joseph, he lists the patriarchs, Joseph's brothers are included in the patriarchs. And they sold him as a slave into Egypt. But God was with him. God was with him when he was sold into slavery, when he was put in the palace, when he was transferred to the prison, and when he was in charge of all Egypt. God was with Joseph, and He rescued him from all his troubles. And He gave Joseph wisdom and enabled him to gain the goodwill of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And so Pharaoh made him ruler over Egypt and all his palace. This is Stephen's final moments, and he brings up our character for today, Joseph, a man of faith. Oh, sure, he was an ordinary man. He had a lot of problems. But he was a man of faith, and he found God in all of those circumstances in his life. And he stands now as an example to us to be able to look for God whether we go through hardship or ease and find God there. We're not abandoned. Now, I know that it seems like you're all alone, especially if you're down in the valley. But God is with us in the valleys as well as on the mountaintop. One last place that Joseph found God was in the promise to fulfill the promise to Abraham to make him a great nation, to make his children a great nation, make him as numerous as the sands of the seashore, which, you grab a handful of sand out at the beach and try counting all of the grains of sand in your hand, and you're going to come up with an innumerable amount. God was saying to Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. There are going to be a lot of people come from you. And that even includes us, who by faith in Christ have become children of Abraham. Yet Joseph remembered the promise that God made. And there are a couple of stories about God's promise, and they are listed here in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22. So the first one is really interesting, and I want to bring this up. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22 says that Joseph told about the exodus from Egypt. What's the problem with that? The exodus of Egypt. Moses hasn't even been born. How did Joseph know about the exodus of Egypt? Well, some people have said, well, Joseph he was a prophet. He prophesied of their exodus from Egypt. And that may be true. Other people said, well, maybe Joseph is just speaking generally. And when he speaks generally, he talks about people coming and going out of Egypt. And that's a possibility. But did Joseph tell his children, the people of Israel, about the plagues of Egypt? Did he tell them about the parting of the Red Sea? Did he tell them about the promised land? We don't know. But Joseph said to the people of Israel, God is going to take us out of Egypt one day. Why, the Egyptians hadn't even forgotten Joseph at this point. Later, the Egyptians would forget Joseph, and they would enslave all of the Hebrew people. But out of that exodus of Egypt, God was faithful to His promise. God was faithful to the people of Israel even when they were in Egyptian slavery. And He'll be faithful to us as well. Faithful to fulfill the promises to us. He's not going to leave us. He's not going to forsake us. When life gets hard, when you feel like you're in the pit, when you feel like you're in the prison, God is near. Joseph also mentions, hey, look, when I'm gone from this life, carry my bones away. Now, you know that several patriarchs were buried in Machpelah, a cave. Abraham was buried in it, and after the Israelites left Egypt, they carried the bones of the patriarchs into the promised land. Joseph himself, remember he was 17 when he was sold into slavery, and now 110 years old. 93 years in Egypt. He spent most of his life in Egypt, and he says, carry my bones out of this place and into the promised land. Joseph had trusted in God that there was life to come from death. Sometimes we use Joseph's father, and maybe you've heard this before, even in the Old Testament. Jesus says this in John chapter 1, verse 51, I think. I don't have that up on the screen there. But John chapter 1, verse 51. God is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Joseph's father. Jesus says, but God isn't the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Jesus speaks as if Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, as well as Joseph and all the patriarchs, all of those who died in Christ, who died in the promise, he speaks as if they are alive and living. God is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living. Joseph trusted in God with his future. Take my bones up from this place and carry me into the promised land. That's where I belong. And I don't think Joseph is making a statement about where your final resting place ought to be or where his final resting place ought to be. Our final resting place is always with God. If Joseph hadn't found God in the pit, and he hadn't found God in the palace, do you think Joseph would have ever thought about God's promises? In the beautiful tragedy that you call your life, whether it goes through pits or palaces, whether it's a valley or a mountaintop, through each and every frail event of your life today and this week, trust God. Trust that God will be there in every moment, just as you need Him to be. He'll never leave us or forsake us. Ecclesiastes, I know that's a hard passage to find if you want to start looking for that now. We're going to put it up here on the wall for you. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11 says, He has made everything beautiful in its time. And I know that the pits and the prisons and even the palace sometimes don't seem that beautiful in life. They seem difficult. A lot of hardship in them. But God is active in those times in our lives to be near us and to help us get through each and every hardship. God will never leave us or forsake us. Romans chapter 8, verse 28, you know that passage. It says that God in all these things is working to bring about good for those who love Him and who've been called according to His purpose. Maybe this passage strikes you. It comes from the story of our own Joseph in Genesis chapter 50. If you turn into Genesis chapter 50 and take a look at just verse 20, Joseph explains his life with all the ups and downs, all the captivities and freedoms that he experienced, Joseph says this at the end of his life: "You intended to harm me." This is to his brothers, who did intend to harm him. First they wanted to kill him, and then they decided just to sell him off into slavery. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what he's now doing and done, the saving of many lives." God can do some strange things through our tragedy and hardship. Joseph found God in each one of these instances in his life. And I think you and I can find God there too. We can look around whenever the floor falls out from under us and realize that God is near us. Whatever it is, the circumstance that we go through, we're looking for God. Not on a piece of toast or on a banana, not on a tortilla or even on a potato chip. We're looking for God to be near us whenever we have hardship. And certainly, we'll find God there. Hebrews chapter 11 later would go on to say, "Without faith it is impossible to please God." Well, Joseph was a man of faith. He looked for God in some very unusual places. And you and I can look around and find Jesus in the pit that we are thrown in the palace that we live in and have responsibilities in, and in the promises that God has made for us in life. Let's look around and find Jesus active in all of those times in our lives. Before we have our invitation this morning, let's go to God in prayer. God, the simple person of Joseph, I'm sure that he was frustrated and angry. He experienced times of that he was afraid, and maybe he even doubted you from time to time. And Lord, I just pray that this week, whatever it is that we face, whether it is a hardship or whether it is some opportunity that we have, that we might look around you and find that you are very near us in each one of the circumstances that we go through. God, be with us this day, that your presence in our lives might be enough. For we offer this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.